that he will issue refunds of his illegal tariffs to every American business that has been forced to pay those tariffs. Donald Trump, being the most incompetent president in history and the president who knows the least about what his own government is doing, his own White House at any given moment, means that it is very likely tonight that Donald Trump is learning this for the first time. It is very likely tonight that Donald Trump does not know, until I just said it, that he made that promise today. Donald Trump's Justice Department lawyers desperately begging an appeals court to pause the unanimous ruling last night by the United States Court of International Trade against the Trump tariffs, those lawyers knew what they would have to tell the appeals court to get the appeals court to pause last night's ruling that the Trump tariffs are unconstitutional and illegal. And so Donald Trump's Justice Department lawyers put it in writing today that Donald Trump will issue refunds of his illegal tariffs if the final ruling in the case by the appeals court or the United States Supreme Court agrees with the real judicial experts about international trade that the Trump tariffs are illegal. The best way to hide important news like this from most people in the news media is to put it in writing in legal pleadings that very few people in the news media ever actually read. There are some newspaper reports about the appeals court decision today to grant the Trump Justice Department's request to pause the ruling in the case. But even those reports don't find the reason why the appeals court did that. The federal appeals court didn't give a reason why they did it. The federal appeals court unanimously granted a temporary pause in last night's ruling by the United States Court of International Trade, saying today, quote, the request for an immediate administrative stay is granted. These cases are temporarily stayed until further notice while this court considers the motions papers. And that's all the appeals court said. They don't have to say why they were doing that, and they did not say why they stayed the case until at least June 9th, which is now the deadline they issued for briefs from both sides to be fully submitted to the appeals court. One of the key factors in issuing a stay during an appeal like this is that the stay will not harm the other side. When you're asking for a stay, you have to make it clear to the court that the stay won't harm the other side in the case. And so, on page 25 of the Trump lawyers pleading to the appeals court today for a stay in the case, Donald Trump's lawyers put this promise from Donald Trump in writing to the appeals court. Quote, if tariffs imposed on plaintiffs during these appeals are ultimately held unlawful, then the government will issue refunds to plaintiffs, including any post-judgment interest that accrues. And a huge amount of interest could accrue on the tariffs that have already been paid. So there's Donald Trump's promise in writing that if and when he loses this case in the final adjudication by the appeals court or by the United States Supreme Court, all of the illegally collected tariff money by Donald Trump, all of it collected from Americans and American businesses, and only American businesses, all of the Trump tariffs will be refunded to those Americans who paid those illegal tariffs. The Treasury of the United States, where that money was collected, knows exactly how to issue refunds. They issue refunds to many of you, millions of you, every year after you file your tax returns and you show that more money has been withheld from your paychecks for taxes during the year than you actually owe. The Treasury sends out millions upon millions upon millions of such tax refunds every single year. Treasury knows how to do refunds. And now, when Donald Trump loses this case, the Treasury will be busy sending out billions of dollars in Trump tariff refunds. And without Donald Trump's promise today to refund that money, it is very unlikely that the appeals court would have granted the Trump side of the case a pause in being subject to the ruling made by the federal judges on the International Court of Trade Court, who know more about international trade than any other judges in our federal system. The very first federal case in a federal court in the United States of America was an international trade case. Litigation of international trade became increasingly more complex over the centuries, and in the 20th century, Congress decided it was time to create a unique federal court with expertise and jurisdiction over international trade cases. In 1926, Congress created the United States Customs Court, and in 1980, with the jet engine having brought international trade to the threshold of true global trade, the Congress clarified and enhanced the standing of the Customs Court and changed its name to the United States Court of International Trade. Democratic Senator Dennis DeConcini, who sponsored the legislation, said the new court would be, quote, a vastly improved forum for judicial review of administrative actions of government agencies dealing with importations. The provisions make it clear to those who suffer injury in this area that they may seek redress in a court, and if they are successful, the Court of International Trade will be able to afford them relief, which is appropriate and necessary to make them whole. And so today, Donald Trump, through his lawyers, had to promise to make them whole, had to promise to refund all of the Trump tariffs paid so far, if and when they are found to be illegal and unconstitutional in a final court ruling. And so, as many humiliation days as Donald Trump has had since he started his failed trade war, Refund Day will be the ultimate humiliation day at the end of Donald Trump's disastrous trade war. Refund Day is coming, and it will be the most humiliating day Donald Trump will suffer in his losing trade war. Tonight, Donald Trump humiliated himself once again by showing how irreversibly stupid and flawlessly ignorant he is of the actual words of the Constitution and their meaning. He did that in a social media post that once again reveals the most severe mental weakness, not just in the history of the presidency, but in the history of federal elected officials in this country. The Trump social media post begins by saying the U.S. Court of International Trade incredibly ruled against the United States of America on desperately needed tariffs. Of course, the correct way of putting that is the United States Court of International Trade predictably ruled in favor of the United States Constitution. Donald Trump goes on to show his inability to pass a high school civics test by saying the horrific decision stated that I would have to get the approval of Congress for these tariffs. In other words, hundreds of politicians would sit around D.C. for weeks and even months trying to come to a conclusion as to what to charge other countries that are treating us unfairly. That is the constitutional design for how this country sets tariffs, or how this country sets tax rates. Tariffs, the exclusive jurisdiction of Congress, according to the United States Constitution. Exclusive jurisdiction. And hundreds of politicians have been sitting around D.C. for weeks and even months now, trying to come up with a Republican budget for the United States, which the House of Representatives managed to pass by exactly one vote. And you never heard Donald Trump complain about the hundreds of politicians being involved in that legislation, hundreds of politicians deciding exactly how to cut Medicaid, how to take health care coverage away from Americans. That was the work of hundreds of Republican politicians sitting around D.C., as Donald Trump would put it, for weeks and even months. And while they were sitting around D.C., those hundreds of Republican politicians decided just how big a tax cut to give to Donald Trump and his family and to Elon Musk and to the richest people in the world. Donald Trump didn't decide that. He's just going to get to sign the legislation when it arrives at the White House. And in fact, international trade deals often take several years of people sitting around D.C. and sitting around Geneva and other capitals in the world, negotiating with other countries the specifics of trade deals and working on the details of international trade that then gets presented to Congress in a final bill that Congress votes on that sets all of the tariffs that this country has. Congress does that, not the president. And there is not a single high school student in America taking an AP government course this year who does not know that. Donald Trump goes on to say, if allowed to stand, this would completely destroy presidential power. The presidency would never be the same! Exclamation point. No, Donald. No, 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 Donald. If the Court of International Trade's decision is allowed to stand, that means the presidency would be the same, as it has always been. The presidency in which no president other than Donald Trump ever tried to randomly set new tariffs all around the world all by himself. No president from George Washington to Barack Obama and then Joe Biden ever did that. Presidents are empowered by law to make very minor, very specific, very temporary changes in tariffs for specific products for a very short period of time. But that's not what Donald Trump did. He put a 10% tariff on the entire planet. Congress could do that. They could pass an economically idiotic 10% tariff on the entire world. But even the Republican Congress isn't that stupid. The Republican Congress is not as stupid as Donald Trump about tariffs. And so Donald Trump has launched into his tariff madness alone, the only president in history to have done so. And with an exclamation point, the utterly lost occupant of the White House tells us that the presidency would never be the same if we actually restore, through sane court decisions, presidential power to what it has always been from the day George Washington took the oath of office. Donald Trump's permanently smiling and totally incompetent economic advisor who never achieved tenure in his brief career as a low-level economics professor before becoming Donald Trump's economics professor in residence, took his frozen smile to friendly television interviewers today by saying that the ruling by the Court of International Trade will not have any impact at all on the Trump team's so-called trade negotiations around the world, in which they promised to deliver 90 trade deals in 90 days and have not yet delivered a single trade deal, not one. And while the childish, by standards of the economic profession, Kevin Hassett, was publicly spewing his nonsense about a court ruling against the Trump tariffs having no effect on the countries that the Trump team is trying to negotiate with, of course, the Trump team was in court putting in writing exactly the opposite. The other point that the Trump lawyers had to convince the appeals court of today in order to obtain a stay was that if they didn't obtain a stay, their side of the case would suffer what the law considers irreparable harm, while insisting that the plaintiffs would suffer no harm because the government will simply refund to them the Trump tariff money if they win. The Trump lawyers insisted that Donald Trump was already suffering harm to his so-called trade negotiations by the ruling of the Court of International Trade, because it takes away what the Trump lawyers called the credible threat. That was their phrase, credible threat of Donald Trump's tariffs, which means that, quote, foreign counterparts will have reduced incentives to reach meaningful agreements. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and U.S. trade representatives similarly explained that the trade negotiations currently ongoing with dozens of countries are in a delicate state and could be shattered by an injunction against the tariffs. So there was the smiling clown of Trump economic policy on television, telling you the ruling by the court has no effect at all on their negotiations with other countries, while at exactly the same time, the Trump Justice Department lawyers are in court telling the appeals court that the negotiations with other countries have been shattered by the court ruling against the Trump tariffs. Quote, those negotiations are premised on the ability of the president to impose tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Just another day in Trump land. The Trump clowns on TV saying one thing, the Trump lawyers functionally under oath in court saying exactly the opposite. And the goofy chaos agent at the center of it all, not having the slightest idea what he's doing or what the people on his team in court are saying. Donald Trump is lost in the White House tonight. He is lost in the madness of his trade war. He does not have and has never had the mental capacity to comprehend a single element of what it actually means to be president of the United States. Donald Trump makes every president who preceded him look better, including the criminal Richard Nixon, who was not half as criminal as Donald Trump, who, unlike Richard Nixon, has actually been convicted of crimes and Richard Nixon was supremely competent compared only to Donald Trump. Richard Nixon's worst day was better than Donald Trump's best day in the White House. And that is not something I said during the first Trump presidency, but the second Trump presidency has turned out to be much, much worse than his first presidency. Of course, the Trump tariff refunds won't make someone whole if their company has already got out of business because of the Trump tariffs. And so until the final adjudication of the Trump tariff case at the appeals court or the Supreme Court, the Trump tariffs will continue to harm the American economy and all of us who live in it.